Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Battleverse Conflict. Today we bring you a deep exploration of the Russia and Ukraine war, a conflict that has not only shaken Eastern Europe, but also altered the very framework of global security. This war is not simply about territory, borders, or military power. It is about history, identity, survival, and the struggle of nations to define their place in the world. What began with the shock of a sudden full-scale invasion has transformed into a prolonged war of attrition that continues to this day, with no clear end in sight. The origins of this war cannot be understood without looking at the broader history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, once part of the Soviet Union, declared independence in 1991, choosing sovereignty over remaining in Moscow's orbit. Yet, for Russia, the loss of Ukraine was not just territorial, it was psychological, symbolic, and strategic. Ukraine was viewed as the cradle of Russian civilization, the land of Kievan Rus, the birthplace of shared Orthodox faith, and a key buffer against the West. When Ukraine began moving closer to Europe, seeking stronger ties with NATO and the European Union, the Kremlin saw it as a threat to its sphere of influence. The seeds of conflict were planted long before 2022, with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the outbreak of war in the Donbas. When Russian forces launched their invasion on February 24, 2022, the world was stunned. Missiles struck Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Tanks rolled across the borders from Belarus and Russia, while troops advanced from occupied Crimea. Vladimir Putin claimed the operation was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, framing it as a defensive act against Western encroachment. But to the rest of the world it was clear this was a war of aggression against a sovereign state. Analysts predicted Ukraine would collapse within days, but the reality unfolded differently. The battle for Kyiv became the first turning point. Russian columns advanced rapidly, but logistical failures and fierce Ukrainian resistance stalled their momentum. The image of Zelensky refusing evacuation, declaring that he needed ammunition and not a ride, galvanized his people. Ukrainian troops, armed with Javelin and N-law anti-tank weapons, destroyed convoys on the outskirts of the capital. Civilians joined the fight, building barricades, preparing Molotov cocktails, and sharing intelligence about enemy positions. By April, Russian forces were forced to withdraw from the north, leaving behind destroyed vehicles, mass graves, and evidence of atrocities in places like Bucha and Irpin. The defense of Kyiv shattered the myth of Russian invincibility and marked the beginning of a much longer war than Moscow anticipated. As Russian troops retreated from the north, the focus shifted to the east and south. The Donbas region, already scarred by years of conflict, became the epicenter of brutal battles. Cities like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk were pounded into rubble, with artillery duels reducing entire neighborhoods to dust. The grinding advance came at enormous cost, with Russia employing massive firepower to achieve incremental gains. Meanwhile, in the south, Mariupol became a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. Surrounded and besieged, the city endured months of relentless bombardment. Civilians hid in basements, hospitals were bombed, and the last defenders, holed up in the Azovstal steel plant, fought until they could no longer. Their stand became legendary, a tale of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. But Ukraine was not only defending, it was preparing to strike back. With the arrival of Western weapons, including long-range artillery systems like HIMARS, Ukraine began disrupting Russian supply lines and ammunition depots. The counteroffensive in Kharkiv in September 2022 shocked Russia as Ukrainian forces retook vast swaths of territory in a matter of days. Russian troops abandoned positions, leaving behind equipment and scrambling to regroup. Shortly after, Ukraine launched operations in Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had captured. Months of pressure forced Russia to withdraw across the Dnipro River, marking another major setback for Moscow. Each victory fueled Ukrainian morale and strengthened Western resolve to keep supporting them. International support became one of the decisive factors in prolonging Ukraine's fight. Billions of dollars in aid flowed from the United States, Europe, and other allies. Weapons, systems, ammunition, drones, and intelligence sharing allowed Ukraine to punch far above its weight. NATO countries, once cautious about provoking Russia, became increasingly bold in their support. Germany reversed decades of policy to send tanks. The U.S. provided Patriot missile defenses, and promises of advanced fighter jets loomed on the horizon. Yet, each new package of weapons carried the risk of escalation, with Russia warning of dire consequences if its red lines were crossed. For Russia, the war turned into a quagmire. What was meant to be a swift campaign became a drawn-out conflict with staggering losses. Western sanctions cut off key industries, froze assets, and isolated Moscow from the global economy. Casualties mounted, with hundreds of thousands killed or wounded. Putin responded with partial mobilization, drafting reservists and sending them to the front. Protests erupted in Russian cities, and many young men fled abroad to avoid conscription. Yet, the Kremlin tightened its grip on dissent, silencing critics and controlling the narrative through state media. For Putin, backing down was not an option. He framed the war as existential, claiming Russia was defending itself against Western aggression. Meanwhile, Ukrainian cities endured wave after wave of missile and drone strikes. Russia targeted energy infrastructure, leaving millions without electricity, heat, or water during freezing winters. Iranian-made Shahd drones darkened the skies, while cruise missiles struck apartment blocks and schools. Despite the suffering, Ukrainians adapted. Engineers restored power grids within days, volunteers provided aid, and air defense systems intercepted many incoming threats. The resilience of the population became a weapon in itself, denying Russia the ability to break their spirit. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of Ukrainians fled abroad, creating Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. Families were separated, homes destroyed, and entire towns erased. Those who remained lived under constant threat, adjusting daily life to the rhythm of air raid sirens. Yet, even in the midst of devastation, life continued. Schools reopened in underground shelters, weddings were held on the front lines, and cultural events persisted as acts of defiance. This war was not only about survival, but about preserving a way of life, a culture, and a national identity. As the conflict dragged into its second year, the front lines solidified into a brutal stalemate in many areas. Trenches, minefields, and fortified positions stretched for hundreds of miles. The fighting often resembled the horrors of World War I, with mud, blood, and artillery dominating the battlefield. Yet technology gave this war a distinctly modern edge. Drones provided constant surveillance, precision strikes reshaped tactics, and cyber warfare blurred the lines between physical and digital conflict. Satellites tracked troop movements in real time, and information warfare raged online, where narratives and propaganda shaped global opinion. Internationally, the war reshaped geopolitics. NATO, once described as brain dead, found renewed purpose and unity. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality to join the alliance, citing Russia as a direct threat. Defense budgets across Europe soared and military production ramped up. The United States reaffirmed its role as a guarantor of European security, while countries like Poland and the Baltic states emerged as outspoken supporters of Ukraine. On the other side, Russia leaned more heavily on China, Iran, and North Korea for economic and military support, creating new fault lines in global politics. Diplomatic efforts to end the war repeatedly failed. Peace talks in Turkey, proposals from China, and mediation attempts by global organizations all founded on irreconcilable differences. Ukraine insisted on restoring its territorial integrity, including Crimea, while Russia demanded recognition of annexed territories. The trust gap was too wide, the wounds too deep, and each new battle hardened positions further. As months turned into years, the question shifted from whether Ukraine could survive to how long both sides could sustain the fight. The war also raised fears of broader escalation. Russia's suspension of nuclear arms treaties and rhetoric about using tactical nuclear weapons alarmed the world. NATO conducted large-scale exercises to demonstrate readiness, while Western leaders walked a fine line between aiding Ukraine and avoiding direct confrontation with Russia. The risk of miscalculation hung over every decision, a reminder that this war could spiral into something even more catastrophic. Yet, through it all, Ukraine's determination remained unbroken. From the ruins of Mariupol to the trenches of Bakhmut, from the liberated streets of Kherson to the blackout-stricken neighborhoods of Kyiv, the spirit of resistance endured. What began as a war for survival evolved into a struggle for the future, not only of Ukraine, but of the principles of sovereignty and freedom in the modern world. And as the conflict continues to unfold, one truth has become clear: the outcome will shape global order for decades to come.